Since I've talked about the ethical views of both Jürgen Habermas and Hans-Georg Gadamer, I want to talk some about the contrast between their views. That's not something that I simply have to project onto them and imagine a discussion. They actually did engage in that discussion. Something wonderful about both Habermas and Gadamer is that they engage people who have different views, and they actually participate in conversations, in dialogues, because they both agree that dialogue is fundamental to philosophical inquiry and to philosophical progress. So far from simply pontificating, writing their own views, sometimes criticizing others, instead they engage in dialogues with people who are coming at things from different perspectives. And they've done that with respect to each other, discussing their respective views, where they differ, and what issues might be involved in trying to resolve their disagreement. Now, Habermas insists that Gadamer's base for understanding ethics as a matter of hermeneutics, the attempt to interpret, to understand other participants in a conversation, he says that's not enough. It's not wrong to think that ethics arises out of these particular problems in particular contextual settings, and that we do engage in dialogue and conversation in order to resolve these questions, but still he says that is not enough. We can do that all we want, but we have to presuppose certain norms of conversation. Apart from the norms, we have no reason to think that conversation will get us anywhere. So Habermas says conversation presupposes norms. And in order to understand the structure of our discourse about ethics, we have to understand what those norms of conversation or dialogue are. Those conversational norms have to be prior to conversation. They're prior to dialogue, prior to inquiry. And so there is a kind of abstract point of view we can take. We can think, what is it to communicate with someone? What is it to engage in dialogue or conversation with them? There must be certain norms that we both respect in order to engage in dialogue or discussion at all. We've talked some about what those conversational norms are. I have to believe that the people participating in conversation with me are actually being honest, being open about their goals, and being sincere. If they're not sincere, if they're instead trying to deceive me, I have no reason to think that I can actually understand them or cooperate with them in this enterprise. I have to believe that their views are reasonably, representationally accurate. I have to think they're based on some kind of fact. If I think they're living in some kind of fantasy world, I may think there is no possibility of really understanding or correctly interpreting each other. Our views about the facts are just too far apart. And there may be a variety of other norms like this, norms that are a matter of being willing to cooperate, or maybe another way of looking at it is to simply say we have to presuppose that we at least share certain goals of understanding, interpretation, and cooperation in order to have any hope of understanding each other. And so Habermas would say there are some basic norms that are presupposed by dialogue or conversation itself. Now, Gadamer's response is that conversational norms are just like any other norms. They're up for discussion. He agrees that conversation presupposes norms, but he says we don't uncover those norms from some presupposition-free perspective, thinking about what it is to engage in linguistic behavior at all. He says instead they form part of the assumptions that we share. So you and I may be able to recognize, okay, we both value sincerity, so terrific. We both have a view of the world that we think is reasonably representationally adequate. We think we're trying to cooperate in seeking joint understanding, and so on. Those things, okay, fine. Now we've got some basis for conversation. On the other hand, Gadamer says there may be contexts where that doesn't matter. I talked in discussing Habermas about discourse where you might just say, the whole goal is for me to be immersed in somebody else's world, and so they just talk. And I just listen. There isn't a very direct goal. There isn't really much of a point. And so I may or may not think their view of the world is representationally adequate, but I just want to hear what it is. I want to be immersed in that world so that I do have a better understanding, at least of their view of things. But even that, Habermas would say, presupposes some kind of sincerity. There might be other kinds of contexts, though. Suppose we're in a fiction writing context. Then I don't think your views are going to be representationally adequate. What you're going to be doing is telling a story once upon a time. And so the whole point really is, well, how good is that as a story? How exciting is it? How do I get involved? Do I believe the characters? Do I find it to be well written, and so on? And in all those contexts, you might say, look, representational adequacy or sincerity, that's out the window. I don't care about that. We're looking to amuse each other with ghost stories over the campfire, maybe, or stories that we're interested in submitting to a literary magazine. Those are very different kinds of contexts, and different presuppositions may apply to different kinds of conversational contexts. So Gadamer says, there is no presupposition-free perspective, no context-independent set of norms. Instead, the norms are themselves presupposed by a particular conversation, but different conversations may presuppose really different norms. Conversational norms, in other words, are social in character. They've got to be shared to count as norms of conversation. They are not norms we derive from nowhere. Instead, they are norms we derive from that particular setting of dialogue, of discussion, of conversation. Well, Gadamer calls that sharing of presuppositions, of norms governing a conversation, solidarity. We do presuppose a solidarity with our audience, with our other interlocutors. We have to have similar enough goals. We have to agree on certain presuppositions, certain basic norms that are going to govern our conversation. On the other hand, they don't have to be ones that are going to be shared by participants in some other conversation. They are themselves tied to our particular goals, to our context, to our history. They aren't absolute presuppositions of all conversation as such. They're being presupposed by these particular participants, with this history, at this time, with this set of questions, with these practical aims. And notice they're open to negotiation and renegotiation. They change over time. It may be that we start with one particular conception of norms, and then we change our minds. We realize, this conversation isn't going nowhere. Let's agree that we're going to do blah, blah, blah. We're going to focus on this. Sometimes people do that. Or sometimes, I've been in a philosophy department for many, many years that had to go through this at one point. We realized that many of the question and answer periods in our colloquies were getting really nasty. And we thought, what do we do to try to improve the attitude of the questioners and to make visiting speakers feel a lot less defensive? Now, to be fair to us, we've never gone around waving fireplace pokers at visiting speakers. On the other hand, we have sometimes engaged in some pretty nasty argumentation. Now, that's not true of us anymore, but we had to reflect on things. We had to say, what is it about our conversational norms that generates these kinds of hostile exchanges? And we had to consciously change them. Luckily, we did that some 20 years ago, and now I think actually these conversations that happen after talks are much more productive, much more interesting, and much less hostile. So that change worked, but it did require a conscious effort to actually change the basic norms surrounding that kind of dialogue. So one way of framing the question between Habermas and Gadamer is simply this. Are our basic conversational norms open for negotiation and renegotiation? According to Habermas, there are certain basic validity claims that are required for any speech act. They've got to be sincere. They've got to be socially appropriate or morally right. They've got to be factually true, representationally adequate. He sees that as non-negotiable. Similarly non-negotiable is the cooperative principle. Make your conversational contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you're engaged. Those things, he thinks, we can't really negotiate. Now, maybe certain Gricean maxims can be negotiated, like the maxim of quantity. Make your contribution as informative as required, but no more so. Or the quality maxim. Try to make your contribution one that's true. Maybe the maxim of relation. Be relevant. Maybe sometimes we allow tangents. And the maxim of manner. Be perspicuous. Maybe, like in certain continental philosophy settings, or actually all philosophy settings, we decide to tolerate a certain amount of obscurity for the sake of conceptual innovation. But in any case, we might suspend certain norms, but there are certain others, Habermas would say, that really are non-negotiable. You have to be sincere. You have to actually be doing something we view as morally and socially acceptable. And you have to be representationally adequate. Gadamer would say, no. There may be contexts where we suspend or renegotiate those two.